we'll have 20 minutes of presentation, and then we will have a 10-minute discussion all together with the audience and all the presenters. And in function of how the times run, we maybe have some few minutes at the end of the session to have a general discussion. So now I leave the floor to Matthias to present us a comprehensive socioeconomic assessment. Oh, the screen had disappeared. I was reading the title, but it was, yeah, a comprehensive socioeconomic assessment of the increased 2030 EU climate targets. So Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariam. Welcome to the session. I hope you can see my screen. Now all up. So, well, I don't have to repeat the title. You just perfectly read this out. This is work with a number of co-authors here at the Joint Research Center. And what I will be talking about today is the new EU climate target or climate target that was analyzed last year and has now been adopted. So let me give you a brief introduction and motivation of the study and the background, although throughout a number of other sessions throughout this conference, I think we've already heard a lot about Green Deal and some of the policy instruments that are discussed as part of it. So we are looking here at the policy that was formally presented in 2019 with the central objective of reaching climate neutrality, net zero emissions by 2050. And this not only has implications for the middle of the century, but also something much closer, because an efficient pathway to that net zero target in 2050 might also need adjustment in the nearer term. And the EU actually had in 2014 put in place a target that would reduce emissions below 1990 levels by 40%. Now that target was set in under a different long-term objective. So once you change the long-term objective, this might no longer be an efficient target. Further, the 2030 target would, even with existing measures, not just the EU ETS, but then renewables and so on, likely be overachieved. And therefore, the Commission analyzed two additional or more ambitious climate targets of -50 and -55% emission reductions relative to 1990. So it did this in an impact assessment looking at technological, economic, social consequences. And this study presents part of the results of this impact assessment. And we tried a little bit when we were looking at this to go beyond the traditional CGE results, which present changes in GDP emissions and sectoral output, and go a bit more into extensions of CGE results. I will focus on the 55% implementation, which is the target that was finally chosen and adopted. So what is the modeling framework that we use? We use several models for a consistent analysis and to look at different specific aspects in particular. The models were fed with a common GDP, population, and other exogenous assumption baseline so that they are consistent. Further, when energy system models, primes and poles were run, we use this as part of the input for our CGE model, GEMI3. Then this model has a representative agent, and we later then applied downscaling tools where we can look at how the results that are having one representative agent influence distributional changes as well as some labor market impacts. And this is what I meant going beyond traditional labor market implications. So I will be focusing on the part that's highlighted in red here. So looking at the CGE results as well as its extensions. As I said, we have a baseline that's commonly or harmonized across the modeling tools. And of course, the baseline is very important because it sets the starting point on how to reach this 55% target. And it's especially important to replicate energy and emission projections that take into account the existing policy framework and where the existing policies might bring us in terms of emission reductions. And as I had said, this already exceeds the pre-existing 2030 target. So therefore, of course, the additional policy of reducing emission even to 55% might not be that big of a step. Also considering that there is a change in the definition, whereas the 55% target is now a net target versus the old 40% being a gross emission target. But by linking this to the energy modeling, we take into account, where we take as an input, the energy balances from these energy modeling outcomes, as well as prices. And then we project input-output tables forward, taking these information into account, and then use those input-output tables to calibrate our CGE model. And therefore, we have implicitly the representation of the current policies and technology development as they were fed into the energy modeling. And this has two advantages. One is we have the same starting point in terms of emissions, energy use, and so on as the energy modeling, as well as then facilitating any soft link that we do with these energy modeling for analysis in the scenarios. And as I move to the scenarios, first I'll speak about the practical terms of how we actually implemented this. And then I'll go into what the scenarios are that we looked at. As I said, we have a set of energy modeling, doing also analysis on how this would affect certain energy generation or energy use in the economy. And these energy models over a CGE model have the advantage that they're more detailed. So for example, in electricity generation, they are representing different technologies, but not only that, but they kind of take into account that there's intermittent electricity, which either needs to be stored or there might need to be backup capacity. There might be other constraints in how fast you can ramp up or down a power plant, and so on. So basically going from the more detailed energy model, which looks at even sub-annual time steps to a CGE model, we basically say the energy model is more suited in telling us what the electricity mix is in 2030. So basically we use this also not only in the baseline, but also in the scenario when we put in the carbon or the climate policy under a more ambitious scenario. So basically we take the electricity generation mix and impose it onto the CGE model. We do something similar for the fuel that is consumed in transport, both in the traditional transport sector as well as household transportation fuel use, where we basically use the energy models a more detailed representation of, for example, an increase in electric vehicles entering the fleet in certain segments, and therefore a strong or a relatively strong increase in electricity as a means of transportation fuel. Finally, we do something similar for households, where household energy use changes due to efficiency measures and replacing of cleaner fuels. So this allows, of course, a lot of decarbonization happening, but we don't want to have this to just fall from heaven, and also need to look at the cost that this implies. For example, switching to an electric vehicle might be coming with some upfront capital cost, or switching to a renovated house needs some investment and some extra use of resources. And this is what we put in on the cost side. So we try to both capture decarbonization and cost coming from the energy model. Now, what are the scenarios that we look at? So there are three main scenarios: a reg, mix, and C price. And these are variants of how actually this, with which policy measures the decarbonization should be achieved. So on the left, we have REG, which is built on basically increasing regulation or standards for various sectors, renewable, efficiency, vehicle standards, and so on. And on the right-hand side, we reach the target mostly through carbon pricing, so a higher carbon price. Also, the scenarios mix and C price include an ETS extension for building and transport. So the current ETS, which is only covering industry, is extended to additional emissions. Finally, there is a number of other dimensions that we looked at in the modeling. So we looked at whether the rest of the world also increased its emissions ambition. There are certain assumptions on the ETS design, on the amount of free allowances and so on. We looked at different labor market closure where we would allow for unemployment, and also very important, we looked at different options for tax recycling, especially in these last or more carbon pricing based scenarios. We see that there is a lot more revenue, and of course, if you use it very useful in a CGE model, you can get some return on this. So let's jump into the results and starting with some macro results. So of course, policymakers are interested in what happens with GDP. So throughout all the scenarios, we found relatively consistent numbers through the analysis, despite the quite different assumptions around, say, a quarter to a third of a percentage point of GDP. So saying that the overall cost is relatively manageable. Then we also can look at the components of GDP, for example, here, investment, and you see that the carbon pricing actually has higher emissions, investment requirements than the regulation-based scenarios. And this comes from the different emission abatement choices under the different policies. So the carbon pricing applies mainly to industry and electricity, and therefore requires that these sectors abate more, whereas regulation applies a bit more towards also households, buildings, and so on. And this would rather be captured in renovation, which does not necessarily come as investment, but is captured then a bit more in consumption. We can also look at employment effects. On the right-hand side, of course, if we assume perfect labor market, nothing happens. But on the left-hand side, we can see that when we assume an imperfect labor market and use tax recycling to recycle revenues, we see that the scenarios which have increasing revenues from broadening the ETS, we'll see that there is actually an increase in employment versus the small decrease under the regulation-based scenario. Moving to the sectoral results, we can see that fossil fuel sectors are the ones that are mostly adversely affected, especially coal, because there's a strengthening of the coal phase out, especially in electricity. We see, on the other hand, that industry is facing also some negative effects, although by far not as strong as for fossil fuels. And then we can see that this depends a bit. So here are the ranges between the different scenarios. So it depends a bit more here, especially on what is assumed on the design of the ETS. These are all for EU does action alone. If there is a global action, actually for EU industry, that does look much better, because then EU with a relatively clean industry sector is actually benefiting from the rest of the world, also being more ambitious. Some sectors also can gain, and these are construction sectors or sectors that supply clean appliances, because there is an additional need to do, for example, renovation. Now, and this is what I hinted at in the beginning, going to beyond the numbers from just the CGE model. So here we have data from household budget survey, and we can look at what are expenditure shares for different income groups, and having always the poorest income decile on the left and the richest on the right. You see, for example, that this is aggregating for all EU member states. that basically you have a very strong decrease in the expenditure share on food as income increases. And we can combine this with price changes that we obtain from the CGE model under the different scenarios. Many sectors actually have very small price changes in final consumption. However, we have a couple where these price changes are more pronounced, especially here for fuel, which is mainly electricity and fuel, especially for heating. And there, the extension of carbon pricing to the or inclusion of household fuel into the ETS leads to a relatively strong increase in the mix, but even more so under the carbon pricing based scenario, which then might lead to regressive effects, so putting a stronger burden on the poor, because there is more, the poor spend more proportional of the income on fuel. Now, there is also the opposite effect. So if you go to the REX scenario, there's more spending on housing as there is more expenditure on, say, renovation. We can see something similar for transport, although a bit more muted. So basically, here we have prices increase under the carbon pricing scenario. We can even see a decrease under the REX scenario, which is basically because households are buying more efficient cars. So the expenditure actually spent on operating the vehicle is lower than before. So how does it look like if we put all these price changes and expenditure shares together? Well, we can see what are the welfare effects for different income groups, and you see this in the in those lines that, for example, here in a pink line, that for the carbon pricing scenario, there is the strongest negative effect because price changes are strongest. And also there's a regressive effect. Households at the lower end of the income distribution lose more than richer households. However, there's also carbon revenue raised, so we could use that to compensate households. And if we do that in a lump sum fashion, we actually see that the pattern reverses and the poorest household are best off. So this would be the dotted line. So there is some way of compensating for potential adverse effects from carbon pricing, and this is also now in the political discussion. We can also look at labor market consequences. So what we get from the CGE model, we get employment effect. You see a strong decrease in, for example, fossil fuels. Some other sectors, as again, for example, construction, there's actually an increase. And we can combine this with the skill forecast provided by CEDEFOP. And they basically tell us how each of these sectors will change their skill requirements over the next decade. So basically saying which sector will require different kind of skills or different kinds of occupations. And when we can combine this, we can see also what skill groups or what type of employment profiles in terms of occupation could actually gain from this policy. And we can see, for example, here, just focusing on the three right bars, that skills that are lower actually do benefit from this, or lower middle actually do benefit from these policies. This is basically, again, because there is industry might be hit a bit more, and sectors like construction or services, well, construction mainly, I think also partly agriculture, they have mainly, or they have a higher share of lower profile skills that is required. We can also see this for occupation. So there's a strong relative, I mean, the strongest increase here is for skilled agriculture workers, but there's also, depending on the scenario, some increase in craft-related workers. So this is basically construction workers. So there is some effect that we can see. However, we have to say it might not have been as good as we wanted initially. As you can also see, this change in skill, for example, is very, very small, and also comes out smaller than the changes that would have happened even without any climate policy. And the reason is that we don't have changes in skill requirements within sectors, and these might actually be much more important. For example, if you think about what we capture here is there might be slightly a shift between sectors, and these might have different, the different sectors might have different skills, but we would not capture anything, for example, where the vehicle sector transitions into producing electric vehicles, which would then maybe require a different skill profile.
Matthias, one minute.
Last slide. And exactly, I'll be almost there. You see, we have used several models using a consistent framework for a multidimensional analysis. So we can say carbon transitioning to a carbon economy comes with limited costs, but we can also look at how this plays out, for example, for distributional impacts, something that's really important to policymakers. And as I said initially, the EU then used part of this analysis to justify why it would go to 55% reduction and submitted an updated target to the UNFCCC, and currently is on in the way of bringing, or in the process of bringing on the way, a large legislative package that would adapt all the policies, say ETS, renewable directives, also a carbon border adjustment, and this would be will be presented next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Are there any questions in the audience? We actually have one from from Francesco Clora, who said, "Thanks, Matthias, for the interesting presentation. You mentioned a soft link between energy models and the CGE model. Can you please elaborate a bit on how you capture costs coming from energy models into the CGE model, please?"
A very good question. I mean, on the decarbonization, I think this is relatively straightforward, and many models move in that direction as well, to basically adjust, say, the generation share of electricity or so. What we do here is, especially in transport and household fuels, we impose additional costs. So basically, when we look at the nest that is depicting the transport energy, for example, we have an energy nest, so we can switch, for example, fossil fuel towards electricity, but then we can require basically more inputs from the non-energy inputs. So to make that part more expensive in the commercial transport sectors. And we do something similar for household transport and household heating, because we have a consumption matrix which basically tells us which are the components that are used to provide heating services.
Thank you, Matthias. There is a question from Frank van Tongeren, who asks, how do you map relative price changes from CGE to absolute changes for household expenditure impacts? Thank you. No, and Francesco said thank you. But I think Frank will say thank you too.
Well, it depends on my answer, so I'll do my best. So what we do we map it to expenditure. Well, we basically take expenditure. So in the household side, we do keep quantities constant. So basically they cancel out. So if there was, say, a 10% expenditure share on a certain good, and this price increases, so basically this comes out as an expenditure would then be 11% or so, or in aggregate, there would be a 1% welfare loss. So we don't necessarily need the absolute prices, neither in the CGE model nor in the household survey data. And actually, many times the household survey data wouldn't even have explicit prices, but rather have the expenditure on certain consumption categories.
Thank you, Matthias. If I may follow up, but you have I mean, so your price changes in your CGE model, they are always relative to something, to your numeraire. So I guess the other question is then, what's your numeraire? Do you have a national CPI as a numeraire or something?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I mean, there is a global basket, basically, that's our numeraire. But we use it, I mean, relative to whatever prices are in the baseline. But of course, yes, there is the global basket, so to speak, as a numeraire flying in the background.
Okay, thanks.
And just as a follow-up to this, I allow myself to ask a question. So the level of the carbon price is also, what is the level of carbon price?
Yep, that's a good question. So that depends on the different scenarios. So in the regulation-based scenario, which had the lowest carbon price, I think it was around 30. Now, of course, that we have already been 30 euros. So, and I think that was also assumed for the baseline. Now, reality has, of course, passed this, because when we started with that was last year, and prices were maybe around that level. Now we have around 50. So we might have been passed a bit by reality. In the other scenarios, the carbon pricing scenario, carbon prices were substantially higher. So there we would reach, say, 45 and I think 68 or so euros without, well, plus or minus maybe 3 euros. I don't know the exact values.
Okay. From Maxime. Yeah, from Maxime, sorry, he asks you about two questions. The first, how do you deal with the fact that CGE models include rebound effects and energy system models don't? Essential an update set of drivers need to be passed to the energy system model from CGE to capture this.
Ideally, yes. For timing and complexity reasons, we only have a one-way link. So we model from the energy modeling to the CG models, but there we do actually see that rebound effect, for example, comes out strongest in the regulation, because there basically you have an efficiency gain through imposed regulation, but you don't have the price signal. So there you have the strongest rebound effect. And with the carbon pricing, that rebound effect is muted a lot.
And the second question of Maxime is about, do you have an idea of how max compare in CGE and energy system model?
Very good question. I don't have an answer ready. That would be something really interesting to look at. I think in general, we try when we run the CGE model in standalone way, there we can basically calibrate the CGE model also to capture a bit like how much abatement do you get for a certain level of a carbon price, for example. So there we can do something, but then we decided in this case, of course, we don't do it. So basically we replace the nesting with a Leontief in the fuel, and then we just impose exogenous shares. And of course that, I mean, then you lose your endogeneity from the energy model. But yes, if we run it alone, we could basically look at that.
Thank you. A question from Susanna. Do you also model policies via increased sectoral investments and capital accumulation? How do you treat R&D related Green Deal investments? This is the question.
Yeah, we don't really treat
Susanna Smith, sorry.
We don't treat this explicitly in this analysis. So we have used different, well, say, for example, recycling schemes, but these were mainly tax recycling or lump sum recycling to look at labor market effects and, well, distributional effects. We haven't looked at, green subsidies, so to speak, but there are there is another model used in the European Commission that has looked at this in more particular detail, where they looked, I think, for different types of recycling in addition to what we looked, although they are maybe more aggregate and use that a bit more stylized.
Thank you. A question from Mohammed Habazan, who asked, he first tell you that you have a very interesting, this is very interesting research. And his question is, are labor and capital also represented in the energy system? If not, how the change in labor and capital demands implied from the energy system, CGE, are dealt with? Thanks.
Yes, we do have capital and labor, partly as part of the GTAP power aggregation, which also comes with capital and labor. But then when there's, for example, we can do some adjustments. For example, if there's a very rapid decline in, say, the coal power generation, we might actually say, well, in the recursive dynamic part of the model, we actually take the capital out rather than say, well, it just moves to another sector because a coal power plant is a coal power plant. I mean, yes, part of the capital you might actually bring to some other sector, but maybe not the entire coal power plant. On the other hand, if there's investment needs, yes, we put this in as well. And I think there it actually helps to have the power sector disaggregated from the GTAP power, because there is increased capital even in the overall power sector, even though you have declining coal generation capital, but you have a strong increase in renewables. And this is what actually drives this increase in investment that I showed in one slide.
We have 2 more minutes, I guess, Maxime, isn't it?
We can start moving to the next presenter because it's now the transition time. So
okay, so that's it. So thank you very, very much, Matthias, for this interesting presentation. And let's move to Dr. Lionel Fontanier, who is going to present us a paper that is entitled EU Carbon Border Adjustment with the US Rejoining Paris, a bit of game changer.
Thank you, Miriam. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. So this is a joint paper with Cecilia Bellora. Cecilia is in the room, so I guess that she may want to jump in the discussion in the last 2 minutes at some point. So before starting, let me just have a small disclaimer. So these views are our views and not necessarily the views of the Banque de France I'm involved in these days. The good news is that it doesn't work. It should. Okay. So the good news is that Matthias has somehow very well introduced the topic. Hold the new, commitments of the European Commission, the new Commission. And so what we're going to focus on here is one part of this big group of measures, which is what comes with the difference in international prices. So the fact that you may have to compensate, or you may want to compensate difference in international prices at the border. So the ETS system in Europe has already been mentioned. So we have to keep in mind that it will be complemented by an instrument, so the compensation at the border for carbon emissions, so the difference in carbon prices. And so on this, we have Ursula von der Leyen in September 2020, who announced the CBM. Then, as you may know, we have had a resolution by the European Parliament in March 2021. And we have the proposal of the EU Commission that should be made public in July, mid-July, and actually it has already leaked, so we have some information on its potential content. So in the interest of time, I will skip this slide on the literature. So we have a bunch of papers on the impact of the CBA, so the different policies that can be used, the fact that it can be done in different institutional environments, so the cost of implementing this and different kind of models. So you know this literature quite well since you are in this room. And so I skip this. And based on this, taking stock of all this, we try to do a kind of original exercise using and combining two models, actually. One which is MAGE and the other one which is Mirage. So you have heard about Mirage, maybe not about MAGE. So MAGE is a macro econometric model developed at CEPI, which gives us a macroeconomic trajectory at the 2040 horizon for each country in the world. And so for regions, we are interested in the model. So based on demography, technical progress, savings, current accounts, etc., etc. And so we impose the main macro variables from this model to Mirage. I will explain how in a second. And then the version of Mirage that we use is the version that embarks greenhouse gases, not only CO2, but all of them. And so on the top of it, this is a model that features global value chains and which is based on the MRO table developed by Implication. So, and we have imperfect competition as in Mirage. So these are the two tools that we're going to combine. And before entering into the details of all this, I would like to shed light on the main questions that arise when it comes to imposing a compensation at the border. So there are actually 7 big questions to address. One is about the scope of the instrument. One is about the tax base. One is about the instrument that you use for taxation. One is about the allocation of revenues. What do you do with the revenues? One is about exporters. Do you rebate exporters for the quotas that they have been purchasing? One is about free allocations, and one is about special and differential treatment for least developed countries. So these are the 7 questions, and here are our choices. So the assumptions that we make. About the scope, we will consider that we will compensate all the sectors covered by the ETS. So this is above the ambition of the Commission, and this is below the ambition of the Parliament, actually. On the tax base, we start by considering EU emissions as a reference, and then we will compare with the emissions of the exporter as a distinct scenario. And we will consider direct emissions, which include energy that is directly used in the process, and afterwards indirect emissions, meaning the emissions that are associated with the electricity mix when you use electricity in the production of your good. About the instrument, so first of all, I have to stress that there is no double taxation. We just make sure that you are not taxed twice, meaning that if a country is taxing carbon, then exporters from this country will be taxed less. Just to take into account this element. And importantly, the instrument that will be used in order to compensate emissions at the border is emissions quotas that have to be purchased by European importers. So this is the solution which is envisaged both by the Parliament and by the Commission. So the idea is just to create a second market. So you have the ETS market and you will have a second ETS market dedicated to importers. I will explain how the two markets are, articulated. This is very important for the results. Now, on the revenues, so we will just put these revenues in the general European budget. And we will consider a situation with and without rebate to European exporters. There is no free allocation of quotas in our scenarios. And systematically, we will have a special and differential treatment for least developed countries. So this is the assumptions that we make. And there is one more layer of assumptions that is important to stress. One element is that we consider that the US are in the Paris Agreement. The second element is that to go back to the discussion that we have had with the previous paper, we have kind of rapid obsolescence of the installed equipment. At the horizon that we consider, most of the equipments in the production processes will have be replaced. And we have also an implicit technical progress, meaning that you have a substitution that can be made between energy and capital. So you can consume less of energy if you consume more of capital somehow. And in agriculture, you have also a substitution between non-CO2 emissions and conventional inputs. Importantly, we consider only unconditional NDCs. So if NDCs are conditional, we don't consider them. We consider unconditional NDCs. But what is important is that the unconditional NDCs will be reached and respected. So for instance, the 55% for Europe that has been mentioned before, this will be reached and this will be binding. So if any policy would, add to the CO2 that we emit, then we will be, constrained by this binding. And then this is the price of carbon that would increase, okay? So this is really something important. So we have this binding constraint, so somehow the supply curve of quota of allowances is vertical, and so you shift the demand curve, and so this is the price which adjusted on the first market, on the first ETS market. And then on the second ETS market, the market for importers, what happens is that the price from the first market is imposed to the second market. So this is just the opposite. Instead of having the supply curve, which is vertical, now you have the supply curve, which is horizontal, which has big implications for the following, as you will see. And the shock that we have is that we impose the CBM in 2023, and we look at results at the horizon of 2040. Okay, so the scenarios now. We have actually 4 scenarios. So the first scenario is just what I said. So we consider only direct emissions. As a tax base, we use the EU. There is no rebate for exporters, and there is a special and differential treatment for least developed countries. But how do we reach this first scenario? This is a 3-step thing. So the first step is just, as I said, to impose, to mirage, the trajectory of the world economy, which is projected till 2040 by MAJ. Okay? The second step is to impose to mirage now the unconditional NDCs that I was just mentioning before. And so this is done with 2 taxes in Europe. One is, the carbon price on the ETS, and one is kind of a tax on the rest of the economy. And in other countries, in non-European countries, you have one level of carbon tax. So this is the second step. And then, endogenously, the model is computing the value of the tax, which makes the GDP consistent and the emissions consistent with the commitments, with the NDCs. And then the third step is to implement one of the 4 scenarios that I was just mentioning. And then you shock, as a third step, the model with the scenario. So the first scenario, you know what it is. The second scenario, this is exactly the same one, but the tax base, instead of having EU as a tax base, we take the emissions of the exporter. The third scenario adds to the first scenario the indirect emissions, so the ones associated with the electricity mix. And the fourth scenario adds to the first scenario the rebate to exporters. So this is how it is organized. Now, the results. So first of all, the CBM is costly in terms of GDP. So you may ask why. This is not obvious. So first of all, this is a distortion that you add to the economy. So this distortion has different implications. The first one is to reduce imports. Then, and this is obvious because imports are more expensive, so you will import less. In particular, you see in the first column that you will import less intermediate goods. But this is not all. This will increase the cost of intermediate consumption of carbon-intensive products for all domestic producers in Europe. For instance, the car industry will pay steel at a higher price. Will pay steel at a higher price because the Chinese steel which is imported will be more expensive, and also because the steel produced in Europe will be more intensive also. Why will it be more expensive? Just because in order to produce additional steel in Europe to replace some of the formerly imported Chinese steel, you will have to ask for new allowances, for new quotas, for new carbon quotas. And then since the supply curve is vertical, this will increase the cost of acquiring these quotas, okay? So the carbon price will increase in Europe because European steel will substitute for Japanese or for Chinese steel, okay? And so this means that the cost of intermediate goods in the downstream industries will increase. And not only this, because the price of carbon in the first ETS market will increase, the price of carbon in the second market will increase also, because this is the price of the first market which is imposed to the second market. Recall that in the second market, the supply curve is horizontal and you move the demand curve, okay? Meaning that there is a second round. The second round is that the price paid by Chinese when they export to Europe their steel will increase not only because there is the CBAM, but also because the allowances that they have to purchase have their price increased by the fact that the price is increasing on the first market. So you see what I mean. So this is this intricate mechanism that has not been envisaged by the Parliament or by the Commission. So at the end of the day, the carbon price in the EU is increasing by 22%, which is a lot. And then if you take a different benchmark, which is the second column, where you take as a reference for taxing the emissions of the exporter instead of taking the emissions of the EU producer, then you see that you magnify these effects and that the carbon price is increasing by more. But now there are two elements. Look at what happens on the markets for steel, for instance. One element is that European producers have a larger share of the pie. But the second element is that steel is more expensive in Europe, and so the pie will be smaller. So in the first column, what is the outcome of the two things? In the first column, you see that the fact that you have a larger share is negligible compared to the fact that the pie decreases. And in the second column, this is the opposite. Okay, so now on the sectoral impacts, these are the results at the sectoral level for the first scenario. So what you see, first of all, is that we need more electricity, so this will not be surprising. We have also an increasing, development of the value added. This is in value added, the change in value added. So an increasing value added in services more generally, because the European economy is shifting from goods to services, just because, you have this increase in the price of good, which is, everywhere downstream in the European economy, from the steel to the rest. And so you consume more services and less manufactured products. And you see that even the sectors which are, in principle protected by the CBAM, like, metals, etc., are negatively affected, just because, as I said, you have, the reduction in the size of the pie, which is larger somehow than the expansion of the share of European producers in this pie. Now, if you go for the other benchmark, which is taking into account the emissions of the exporter instead of the European emissions, this is very much changing the landscape. because now you see that metals are on the positive side, which was not the case before. Chemicals are on the positive side also. And then what happens is that the movement between the size of the pie and the share of the pie is leading to a different outcome. Discussion of all these results. What about global emissions? So global emissions, we measure them here as global emissions avoided if I just do the accumulation of all years from 2023 to 2040. So these are the accumulations. These are the emissions that are avoided over this period. So the light blue bar, so the biggest one, is corresponding to the outcome of, having the US coming back into Paris. And the dark blue bar is the impact of the CBAM. So you see that in terms of global impact, the CBAM has a much lower impact compared to the return to the US. So the big news, if you look at the news, and the good news for the climate is the return to the US, into Paris, much more than the CBAM. So the CBAM will avoid like 5 gigaton compared to 91 for the US. So this cannot be compared. So now, does anyway the CBAM the job or not in terms of reducing the leakages? And so this is what we can compute. So the leakages, if you cumulate again the leakages of the European policy from 2023 to 40, this corresponds roughly to 18 gigaton of CO2, okay? And so the CBAM, depending on the reference that you use, will reduce these leakages by 26% in my first scenario and 45% in my second scenario. So you see that somehow the CBAM, if we think in terms of direct and indirect leakages, this is the sum of the two, is doing the job.
Minutes.
Yeah, I'm basically done. So this is indeed work in progress. So the next step is to redo the exercise with GTAP 10. We were a bit constrained by the availability of the MIO. To introduce the new baseline of marge. I do not enter into the details, but we have a new baseline for marge, and to introduce the new trade elasticities that we have been computing at CEPI. So this is what we have next to do. On the conclusion side, so if I try to see what the CBAM does, so indeed this is something which is necessary to enable the Green Deal ambition, because otherwise from the political economy point of view, it will be difficult. So you have to recall, and this is an important contribution of this paper, that it is increasing the price of ETS or the price of carbon on the first and the second markets. It will reduce imports and exports in the EU. It will reduce the leakages, and it has a limited impact on overall emissions. So if I accumulate emissions, as I said, this corresponds to something like 16 months of EU emissions. So if you accumulate over 2340. So the return of the US to Paris is really the big news and the good news. It has a much greater impact on global emissions than the CBAM. And on the top, it reduces the risk of retaliation because we don't have double taxation. And so if we can add a conclusion to the conclusion, the next good news that we are all waiting for is China enhancing its ambition in terms of climate policy, as the US just did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lionel, for your presentation. So we have Luca Salvatici, who says that it's a very interesting result. And he asked you, did you use the model to compute the cumulated emissions along, sorry, yes.
Along the global value chain. So
yes, thank you.
It has been popping up, and so I had time to read it. Okay, so thank you. So this is a very good point. So then there are two things that could be done. One is to compute emissions along the value chain and to take this as a reference, and I will tell you more in a second on this. And one is to say, okay, we can compute where leakages are, located in the global value chain. So the two are very, very interesting. So now, when it comes to the do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, on my side, there was a problem of connection. And so if you look at what the Parliament wrote, the Parliament was much more ambitious than the Commission on that front. What the Parliament suggested was to take, as a second step, all products into account, meaning that if I take the example of steel and car, so what the Commission has in mind is to compensate at the border for steel, exactly as I explained, and exactly as we modeled. But what the Parliament had in mind was to look at value chains, in particular downstream, to see how you could compensate also for the carbon embodied in downstream products. And so the idea of the Parliament was to say, okay, take a car, and so let's figure out what is the content in terms of steel in a typical car. Then how much have you paid for carbon incorporated in that steel in China? And then you would impose a carbon compensation on the car when the Chinese car is entering into Europe in order to make sure that the loss of competitiveness of European producers of vehicles is compensated also. So this was, the proposal of the Parliament. So indeed, this has an enormous, complexity in terms of operationality. So this is basically something which is impossible, at least in the short run, to implement. And so we decided not, we could have done the computation of this, but we decided not to do it just because we think that it will never be implemented just for practical purposes. But this would be important to take care of this when it comes to speaking of a level playing field, etc. This is something which is often mentioned, the fact that the compensation at the border will lead to a level playing field. So this is not true at all. So the level playing field is there within Europe for steel producers, but the competitiveness of downstream producers like car producers vis-à-vis steel will be strongly reduced in this exercise.
Thank you, Lionel. Now we have a question from, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. A question from Raffaele Garafa, who thanks you for the presentation. And he asked you, could you comment a bit more about how the rapid obsolescence assumption was implemented? Does it affect all sectors? Have you simulated scenarios without accounting for rapid obsolescence?
So this is a very good point. So an important element in the presentation of Matthias, I guess, something that I liked a lot, at least, was this graph, stylus graph, where he had the two extreme policies, one which is regulation and the other one which is carbon prices. And so there is kind of policy mix to design, which will be a combination of the two. So in a model like Mirage, it's not so easy to model the regulations for reasons that are obvious to everyone. And so basically, we put much emphasis on the carbon price, but it is evident that the policy adopted in the EU will be a combination of regulations and carbon price, increase in the carbon price indeed. And so in order not to put too much emphasis on the carbon price, we took care of elasticities, etc., in order to make sure that the substitution between capital and energy was, dynamic enough to authorize this technical progress, which authorizes you to shift from one energy to another when you replace your equipment. And so this is one thing. And the second thing is that we have to decide on a certain, pace, rhythm of replacement of capital. And so this is what we have. We have obsolescence in the model, which is common to all sectors. So this is very rough. Obsolescence is common to all sectors. And given the pace of obsolescence that we have, we end up with 90% replacement of all industrial equipments at the horizon of 2040. So meaning that this is mimicking the fact that we will have regulations making it impossible to use, equipments that are already installed, and they have to be changed. The heating in the factories, etc., have to be changed in order to make sure that you respect the targets. And so how did we somehow calibrate the elasticities, etc.? So we we did kind of reverse engineering. So we started with abatement curves up to 2030, and we calibrated the elasticities in the model in order to respect, these abatement curves. And this is only after that we have been shocking the model with the exercises that I was mentioning.
Thank you. We have now a question from Marila Maliszewska, who said that this is a great presentation, and she thanks you. And she asked, did you have a chance to look at the impact of different scenarios on developing countries?
Yes. Actually, since there are two types of developing countries, so I will be a bit schematic. So there is China, and there are least developed countries. So indeed, the world is not like this, but just to make my point. So if you look at least developed countries, so it has no impact because systematically we adopted this assumption of a special and differential treatment. And so it means that they are not affected by the policy. So their exports are not compensated at the European border. Okay, so they are out of the scheme. Now, an important player into this landscape is China. So the question is, what about China? If you ask a Chinese representative whether they like this proposal, they will answer no, we don't, and we will go to the WTO and we will, challenge this measure. Now, if you look at the results of the model, this is less obvious. Actually, they are not so much affected, and possibly they are not affected at all. How is it? Just because they are disadvantaged on steel, to keep my example running, to make it simple. So they will export less steel to Europe because European producers will substitute European steel to Chinese steel. But at the same time, the Chinese steel, which is not taxed, which is incorporated in cars exported by China to Europe, will not be compensated because the cars are not compensated for the reasons that I was mentioning before, responding to Luca. So there is no downstream products that are, compensated. Meaning that if we look at the results of Mirage, we see that Chinese will be losing in terms of steel, but they will gaining in terms of export. I mean, when they export to Europe, they will be gaining in terms of cars. So what they lose on one end is basically compensated by what they gain on the other end. So this is a complex story. So there are sectors that will suffer from this in China, and there are sectors that will gain from this in China. And so if you put all this in dollars, if you add up all this, you will see that at the end of the day, there is no pain for China as a whole. But indeed, the steel sector in China will suffer.
Thank you, Lionel. Perhaps actually the time is already away, but if you can answer very quickly to these two last questions, one from Maxime, who congratulates you. No?
Sorry, Miriam, maybe we can move to next presentation and Lionel
Sure.
can answer in the chat so that we will stick to the
I will.
schedule if
Great.
that works. Okay.
It will
Thank
be
you for your
better.
comments.
Thank you.
So now we move to Dr. Mohamed M. Habazam, who will present us a paper that is entitled Implication of the Paris Targets for the Middle East through Different Cooperation Options. The floor is yours, Mohamed.
Thank you very much. Sorry. So, can you hear me? Guys, can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, we hear you very well.
Good. So, I'm talking about the implication of the Paris targets for the Middle East through different cooperation options. It's done together with Christian Hinchhausen at TU Berlin. So, I think this is a kind of general repetition of what we all know, but I'm going just through it quickly. That we know that by the Paris Agreement, the target is to improve a sustainable low carbon prospect and through acceleration of actions or intensification of green investments to keep the global average temperature below 2 degrees or even below 1.5 degrees. And most of the countries have submitted their pledges as NDCs mostly by 2030. However, there are countries who haven't contributed and didn't submit any quantified commitments. And ETS or carbon pricing is regarded as a cost-effective policy instrument to internalize the cost of climate damage into prices, which can allow for international trade mechanism to happen. And then, however, there are cases that ETS may result in welfare losses in some participating countries. Here, this project is actually as an individual contribution to the CARPRI or EMF 36, in which it is about a CGE model intercomparison study based on GTAP 9 data set, and at the minimum has to be 14 regions and 13 sectors plus household, government, and investment. To implement the ETS, which is known as cap and trade. So there are various core scenarios investigating policy regimes to fulfill the NDCs and their widespread economic impacts, where 18 models contributed. And there is also a subgroup of EMF coalition, which investigate coalition options including and beyond EMF 36 co-scenarios. There are 7 models contributing. So this is a quick results from the TU Berlin contribution to EMF 36 on the MAC curves. On top, we have CO2 prices versus CO2 reduction in percentage change, and also CO2 prices versus CO2 reduction in absolute changes. So we can see that for some selected countries like China, Europe, India, Middle East, and Russia, Europe has the highest MAC curve regarding the percentage change, but still we can see that Middle East also has one of the highest, and that is mostly because of the underdeveloped actually technologies in the Middle East, and hence for the just the NDC targets, the results by the TU Berlin shows that only for like 2% reduction in emission in the Middle East, we can see that over 3% reduction in GDP and welfare, like the household consumption, for example. And then, so this is kind of huge for this country, for the region. And what I'm going to do is going through the Middle East and disaggregate the region and see these effects in more detail. Okay, so just a brief literature review that that Middle East was not really investigated very well, and some there are studies show that actually Turkey in the region cannot really reach its NDCs, and possibly Saudi Arabia and Iran also cannot, and Chepeliev and Van de Mesburger showed that the subsidy elimination per se might even be enough to reach NDCs for the Middle East regions. So the research gap here is that no study looked specifically into the carbon price mechanism in the Middle East, and the Middle East is treated as an aggregate region so far in the EMF 36 core scenarios, and some geopolitically relevant coalition options within the Middle East and between the Middle East and those outside regions are not modeled. So here is the data provided by EMF 36 steering committee for the regions within Middle East, and you can see that, for example, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Jordan and Kuwait. So there are no quantified NDC reductions for these regions, and overall the region contribution to carbon mitigation is really low. So there are, of course, other obstacles in the region. War and international conflicts makes it really complicated. And then, for example, Iraq and Syria are even not represented in the GTAP data, and they haven't submitted anything as INDCs. And Iran and Turkey have not ratified the Paris Agreement. And of course, international sanctions make things complicated for Iran. So, let me just pass these details and go through showing this pictures on CO2 emission and CO2 emission intensity. You can see that Iran is doing really a terrible job. So the highest emission in the region and highest emission intensity in the region, which is quite double the global average, and even the 1.5 above the average in the region, in the Middle East itself. So there are countries that are doing really good, like Jordan, Israel, and so on. So overall, you can say that the region is really heterogeneous regarding the CO2 emission and emission intensity. So the model by the Berlin team was built like this. The core code is from the GTAP in GAMS, the latest version by Lambs and Rutherford, and then the carbon pricing and ETS is added through the description by Boehringer and Rutherford. Of course, GTAP 9 power is used, where 4 power generation technologies, renewable, nuclear, fossil, and others are disaggregated for producing electricity. And the international commodity trade is according to the Armington approach. So I'm not going into detail of the nesting structure for the sake of time. And yeah, here is the model regions that the Middle East is disaggregated into Iran, Saudi Arabia, XFE, which is the rest of the net fossil fuel exporting countries, including United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar, and XNE, which is the rest of regions, including Israel, Jordan, Turkey, and XWS. So, so the baseline the baseline is taken from the International Energy Outlook IEO projection. So on the left you can see the CO2, how it increases, and until 2030, and the GDP on the right. You can see that Iran is struggling with the GDP, which is mostly due to the sanctions, and of course it's assumed that the sanctions are lifted after a while. So that's the assumption here, which is not so far is not relevant, but we don't know about the future. So let's move to the rest of the paper. So these are the NDC's targets that for Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the other two regions in the aggregate regions in the region, and also for China, Europe, India, and Russia. So we have chosen these four countries as, you know, having the most significant power and geopolitically in the region for some theoretical, carbon pricing and ETS. So here you should just note that Russia NDC is really low, also India and China. However, Europe is actually contributing a lot to mitigation. So the results, this is the baseline results, which shows that first of all, you should note that for calibrating the model, I've implemented some baseline CO2 prices, which you can see that for Saudi Arabia is really high, and for Iran is lower, but still it's high. And all of this is due to lack of, technological changes or like factor productivity improvement and so on, which is just one assumption. Of course, it could be other ways, but so far we have just to stick to these assumptions. And you can see that Iran mostly, the emission in Iran is mostly done by burning oil and gas. However, in Saudi Arabia is just by burning mostly oil, and but in X and F, like rest of fossil fuel countries is gas, but for XNE it's again oil. So here are the MAC curves. The MAC is lowest for Iran, but the highest for Saudi Arabia, and which is kind of obvious also through the emission intensity picture that we saw before. So here are the cooperation options, and in the reference case, all regions in the model, 17 regions actually have to comply with targets without any cooperation. There is one special a special scenario in which that all countries are comply to their target, but the Middle East actually, and then there are some cooperations within the Middle East. In this case, Iran, Saudi Arabia, XFE and XNE, all regions are cooperating, and then all the regions are cooperating either with China, Europe, India, and Russia, and there is also a global cooperation. So let's jump to the results, and you can see that first of all, in the no ME case, there is overall a leakage, to the Middle East, either for like low ambition targets or for high ambition targets. The cooperation within the Middle East are not really something beneficial to the overall region, which is mostly due to like low ambition levels, actually, or very close ambition levels. Then you can see that the when the region cooperate with Europe, actually there is a huge reduction in CO2 emission and in both low and high ambition levels. However, with China, India, and Russia, it's vice versa. It's actually interesting that there is an increase in emission, mostly because the Middle East actually appears as a demander of emission permits. And but for the global scenario, when it's low ambition level, like for NDC, the Middle East is actually supplier of emission permits. However, for higher NDCs, like higher targets, it's a demander of emission permits. Now, let's move to the CO2 emission. For regional, you can see that for the no ME scenario, there is a leakage to Iran and also to XFE and XNE. So in both low and high ambition levels, but however, not to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is anyhow kind of affected by terms of trade, and which makes the it's even in the no ME scenario, the emissions are even lower than the baseline. So then you can see that Iran the emission in Iran is hugely reduced by cooperation with Europe, and also all other countries in this region kind of reduced their emission. That's because of the high difference in the carbon prices for these regions. And of course, this is also kind of visible for the global scenario. But as it was the case for the overall region with China, India, and Russia, this is not the case. So this is the carbon price. Of course, the carbon price could be really high due to the lack of technological changes and so on in the models so far. And then here we can see that regarding the welfare, we can see that for the cooperation between Middle East and Europe, Iran is highly gaining, and in which the welfare goes even beyond the baseline scenario for both like low and high ambition levels. So, and of course, terms of trade are a factor here, in which for Saudi Arabia, it is obvious that why they are losing welfare. So as a discussion, I should say again that there are different interpretation of NDCs of some region in the Middle East than those used in this study, of course, but we are just stick to the NDCs provided for the EMF 36. The technological representation in the model strictly follow the representation in the GTAP data set, and there are no backstop technology. So other policy mechanisms like fossil fuel subsidies could also potentially be combined with what we have done here, but these are left for future research. Of course, market power is an issue. Like Saudi Arabia has a market power in oil market, but we haven't considered it yet. And also factor productivity, as I said, are not taken into account. So for the conclusion, Saudi Arabia, XFE and XNE have the highest baseline carbon price in order. On the other hand, Iran, XNE and XFE have the lowest max in order. Much of the effect on the Middle East comes from the carbon revenue and terms of trade. In case of the no climate policy in the Middle East, there are a leakage to Iran, XNE and XFE, but not Saudi Arabia under low ambition levels. The reference scenario, the highest carbon prices will occur for XNE, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And under high ambition levels in the reference scenario, the highest carbon price will occur for Saudi Arabia, XFE, and XNE. So the cooperation within the region in the Middle East are not welfare increasing if the aggregate welfare is considered. However, we could see that Iran could just a little bit gain welfare, but this is not really huge. And under high ambition levels, Iran mostly enjoys from cooperation within the Middle East, as I said, whereas Saudi Arabia experiences a welfare loss. The region in the Middle East will demand emission permits and do not benefit under cooperation with China, India, or Russia. The region in the Middle East highly benefit from the cooperation with Europe while acting as suppliers of emission permits. Iran exceptionally, gains welfare beyond its baseline when cooperating with Europe. In the global cooperation, the region highly benefits, and the position of the Middle East in global emission market shifts from a demander of emission permits to a supplier of emission permits when ambition levels increase. So that was my whole presentation. Let's see how I can.
Thank you very much, Mohammed.
How can I come back to?
To what?
To see you guys. Okay, stop sharing. Good.
Thank you. So, does anybody have a question? Maybe I might have one question regarding the because for the constraint of time you have passed very quickly about the modeling framework. So perhaps you can tell us a bit more about some details about this modeling framework. So it's multi-regional CGE model where you have all the Middle East regions, and the rest of the world is exogenous. That's it.
No. Actually, it's a multi-region, multi-sectoral CGE model where
global.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And as I said, within the EMF 36, there were suggested that at minimum there should be 14 regions, and Middle East was just represented as one region. And here I just, disaggregated Middle East into 4 other regions, which are Iran, Saudi Arabia, as the main contributors to emission within these regions, and also 2 aggregated regions, which are mostly oil exporters and non-fossil fuel exporters.
Okay. From Rafael Garafa, thank you for your answer, sorry. He said, thank you, Mohammed, for the presentation. I might have missed it, but could you tell us about changes in oil prices in the most stringent scenarios?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't produced these the figures on that, but oil price actually reduces due to the huge cut in the demand. But I do not have its exact, cut in the prices in my head. And of course, the more stringent the targets, the highest reduction in the oil price. Yeah, that's why I assume that like this market power and so on could be important. However, I was struggling with it because most of the maybe it's not really relevant to this question, but I should say that most of the studies that I have seen, there were like regions that have climate policies and regions that do not have climate policies, and then regions like Saudi Arabia, or let's say like oil exporters, then they have some market power that can use, and also like there is this green paradox that which there can be a shift from the emission leakage from one country, one region to another region. However, within the EMF 36, because all the regions have some targets, so it was a bit confusing how I should represent this gearing paradox in the model. So hopefully for the next paper, I will figure it out.
Any other question?
So this is Maxim, if I make a quick question. Thanks for the presentation. So I was wondering, so in the standard aggregation, you have an aggregate region, and then you disaggregate the region and explore the different coalitions and so on. So I was wondering, are there any implications for the rest of the world, for other regions, if you compare the disaggregated and aggregated region, like, in terms of impacts on other regions, do you have any idea of how this disaggregation has impacted your results, or did it mostly, has implications for the region of interest itself?
Well, mostly, actually, first of all, I should also thank you because, before this, you once commented on our paper and it really increased the quality of our research so far. So anyhow, honestly, we haven't looked at that so far. So we just focused on these regions and also these like geopolitically relevant regions. However, I assume and I agree that it's really interesting to see whether there are any gains or losses by doing this disaggregation or not. But we haven't looked into it yet.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe a last question or comment? So
Networking problem. That's not a question.
produce, yeah. Okay. Okay. So we can move to the last presentation. Maxime? Is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we finally welcome Bruno Kuna, who will present us a paper that is entitled Improved Food Intake in OECD Countries as a key Global Climate Mitigation Driver. The floor is yours, Bruno.
Thank you, Marine. Can you see my slide?
Yeah.
But it's not, could you put them in full screen option? Yes, super.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I will present this study, Improved Food Intake in OECD countries as a key global climate mitigation driver. And this study was developed by me, Angelo Gurgel, and Rafael Garafa. And first of all, there is more evidence than ever before that food in the Anthropocene represents one of the greatest health and environmental challenges. The global food system emits nearly 1/3 of the total anthropogenic GHG emissions, a quite similar share to those from global electricity generation. Land use change, synthetic fertilizers, enteric fermentation, and manure left on pasture account for 75% of emissions, with the last two directly associated to the production of ruminants, livestock. Here we can observe the evolution of meat consumption in the last 20 years from the OECD database. USA, Canada, and Australia stand out with higher but relatively stable levels of meat consumption, while Russia and Korea with higher growth, indicating a dietary transition. In terms of protein content, USA, Canada, Europe, and Korea rely more on animal-based food than others, according to recent data from FAO Stat database. So in this context, urgent transformation in food systems are needed, which entails changing mentality, recognizing the importance of consumer choices. The concept of health diet gained importance in the debate, especially in relation to the trade-offs between plants and animal-based foods. In 2019, the Eat Lancet Commission launched what is referred to as the Eat Lancet Reference Diet, which quantitatively describes the first attempt to set universal scientific targets for the food system, based on an increase in consumption of nutritious foods like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, and nuts, and a decrease in consumption of energy-dense foods such as red meat, sugar, and refined grains. And these reference diets provide major health benefits, while also defining a sustainable food system that minimize damage to our planet. In addition, the Eat Lancet Commission is clear that reaching the Paris Agreement targets is not possible by just decarbonizing the global energy system. So how a voluntary improved food intake in OECD countries contributes to global GHG emissions reduction? To address this issue, we use the T model, Total Economy Assessment model. It is a recursive dynamic, multi-regional and multi-sectoral computable general equilibrium. The baseline parameters are calibrated using the GTAP 9 database. We are working to update to GTAP 10. The T model can run on a standalone basis or soft linked with the coffee model. It's another model from coffee in University of Rio de Janeiro. And this kind of model is a partial equilibrium bottom-up model focused on energy and land use system. The T model represents 18 regions that emphasize developing countries or economic groups with possible energy and environmental importance in the long run. And for this exercise, we focus on OECD countries, here represented by 8 regions. The economic activity is characterized in each region by 20 sectors, including a detailed representation of energy supply and demand, as well as flexibility in the possibility of substitution between energy sources, mainly in the power sector. In addition, T explicitly represents the food production and land use system, which includes the agricultural and livestock sectors, as well as plant and animal-based food industries. Here, we can observe the Eat Lancet Dietary Recommendations relating on reduced intake of meat, on average less than 30 grams per day, right? While vegetables, fruits, legumes, and nuts gain importance. So comparing the protein content between the Eat Lancet reference diet with the current OECD dietary pattern, it's possible to observe relevant regional difference by each food sector represented in T model. So here we can see the difference related to agricultural products, fruits and vegetables. Here for plant-based food products. Here basically eggs and milk and dairy products, right? Fishing products and animal-based food products. So these differences are gradually eliminated for each region in the OECD diet scenario until 2050. The idea behind this scenario is to analyze what is the mitigating role of a voluntary modification in individual preferences motivated by environmental concerns, not induced by market price, as well as in the base scenario. The socioeconomic drivers rely on SSP2 store line. Both base scenario and OECD diet scenario do not consider any carbon budget restriction. And the idea, the two kinds of policies are contrasted here in this exercise. One, as I said, an improved food intake condition, quantity shock, which we simulate a rebalancing in OECD consumers' preferences between animal and plant-based food, according to the Eat Less reference diet, here illustrated by the OECD diet scenario, and a pricing mechanism to induce behavioral changes in two climate scenarios. These two climate scenarios differ by carbon budgets, 1,000 gigatons of CO2, and another with 600 gigatons of CO2 emissions. But all aim to stabilize the global average temperature in well below 2 degrees. For both climate scenarios, we set a market-related climate policy represented by a global cap and trade system from 2020 onwards. And this market runs under a perfect competition and incorporates energy CO2 emissions credits for industrial sector and households, allowing international and intersectoral trade in order to establish an equilibrium global carbon price. However, there are limited incentives to reduce agricultural emission because non-CO2 basis allowance are not accounted or traded. So to include this, the right incentives for agricultural non-CO2 emissions, we derive carbon taxes from the global carbon price using GWP emission metric and add them to the capital productive factor of agricultural sectors. So we understand that the capital employed in the production of agricultural activities is closely related to emissions of the pollutants, for example, cattle and livestock sector. Multi results, we start analyzing macroeconomic impacts. So results suggest a marginal decrease in global GDP in climate scenarios from 2020 onwards, compared with the base scenario, reaching around minus 0.3% in well below 2 degrees 100, 1,000 scenario, and minus 1% in well below 2 degrees 6,600 in 2050. The implementation of global cap and trade for energy-related CO2 emissions, as well as agricultural non-CO2 emissions pricing mechanism, represent a growing global GHG price in 2020-2050 period, reaching 24 or $55 per ton of CO2 in the climate scenarios in 2050. This table shows the annual growth of global household food demand in contrast with OECD regions until mid-century by scenario. It's possible to observe that global food demand for agricultural products, vegetables, fruits, and plant-based foods are higher in the OECD diet scenario than the base scenario. On the other hand, results indicate a reduction of 50% on global household demand for animal-based food products. Here represented by ONT, right? In a regional analysis, Australia and Europe stand out with high growth rates for plant-based food products in the OECD's diet scenario. And the USA presents the biggest annual degrowth for animal-based foods, almost nearly minus 2.3% per year on average. All of these results are related to the dietary change proposed in the OECD diet scenario, which also drives marginal changes in food prices in the future. And plant-based food prices tend to increase while animal-based food to decrease. And in the climate scenarios, it's possible to observe the influence of the agricultural non-CO2 emissions pricing mechanism on the global food system. All sectors that produce foods are likely penalized, resulting in higher consumer prices and lower food demand compared with the base scenario. Another important macroeconomic impact can be analyzed in the next picture. The economic sector behind the food demand are marginally impacted by the cap and trade system, while the improved food intake in OECD countries results in significant transformations in the global food system. With the improvement of the food consumption in OECD countries, the global production of plant-based food may increase about 8%, more than the base scenario. And economic activities related to the production of animal-based foods can decrease up to 11% in 2050. In terms of plant-based food production, Japan, Korea, and Russia stand out, followed by Europe and Australia. And the game changers are the USA and Russia, with impressive up to 40% reductions in livestock production in 2050. In terms of GHG emissions, we can see that the global cap and trade system in climate scenarios induce significant curbs in CO2 emissions from the global energy sector, in particular. The biggest emissions cuts occur in fossil fuels, mainly coal, which accounts for relevant non-CO2 emissions as well. And pricing non-CO2 emissions from agricultural sector affects the market competitiveness in the food system, but also contributes to reducing regional and global GHG emissions in order to stabilize the temperature well below 2 degrees. And lower food production and demand by households in alternative scenarios ensure reduction in agricultural emissions. And comparing global non-CO2 agricultural emissions from the climate scenarios in the OECD diet scenarios, it is possible to observe analogous emissions trajectories.
2 minutes, Bruno.
Sorry?
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. In OECD regions, the USA and Russia stand out with up to 30% cuts in methane emissions from agriculture and livestock sectors, followed by European Union and Canada with nearly 13%. However, the growing demand for plant-based food induced a marginal increase in nitrous oxide emissions in OECD diet scenario 2. Finally, analog for what can be achieved over the next decades via dietary patterns enhancements, we estimate the opportunity cost of the refusal to an improvement food intake and in OECD countries. Improved food intake in OECD regions reduce global methane emissions by 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents from 2020 to 2050 relative to the base scenario. And the USA respond by almost 60% reduction of the methane emissions from the agricultural sector, followed by the European Union and Russia. And including all non-CO2 emissions from the agricultural sector, it is possible to estimate global climate-related costs around $30 billion to $57 billion during the 2020-2050 period, depending on the discount rate, right? And we estimate this using the net present value method. So the social cost of carbon express the impact of additional units of agricultural non-CO2 emissions in monetary values based on GHG prices. Final remarks, climate policy may have greater impacts on the global food system. Lower pressures on food demand are found in voluntary improved food intake scenario than in induced GHG pricing scenarios. Global methane emissions projections from livestock sector in the OECD diet scenario are quite similar to those in well below 2 degrees 600 scenario. And there is an opportunity cost in maintaining the current diet pattern in OECD countries. Avoid social cost of carbon could amount to $31 billion to $57 billion over 2020-2050 period in the OECD diet scenario. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Any question from the audience or the other presenters?
I have a quick question. This is Maxim. Thanks for the presentation. So I'm wondering, how did you deal with a point of food consumption outside home, for instance, like in the service sector? So especially in many developed countries, 20-30% of food is consumed outside home, like in restaurants, hotels, you know. So my question is, how did you capture it and represent in your modeling framework?
Yes. Depending on the, thank you for the question first, but depending on the breakdowns, the structure of the model, we capture the consumption of household by mainly in the industrial sector, represented by the plant-based food industry and plant and animal-based food industry, and in this service sector too. So these kind of sectors represent in our model the main sectors that that provide food for society, so for the population. So the idea is to capture how this dietary change are induced by environmental concern or price shock with a global system, a global market, a carbon market. We can see how these influence this kind of economic activities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. We have still time for some more questions. Okay. So maybe we can conclude the session. Thank you to all the presenters for all these different points of view, different angle d'attaque. I don't know the word in English, but it was geographically and sectorally very, very rich. And so thanks to all of you. So now we can have something like 10 minutes rest before the next GTAP sessions. One is about Africa, I have said. I have seen, sorry. And okay, so I will leave you take some minutes of rest before going to enjoy other rich sessions as was this one. So thank you to all of you. Thank you.